The High Synod of the Zaltari did not scream when the end of their civilization appeared on the holographic projectors. They merely ceased to breathe, the collective intake of methane stalling in the gilded throat of the council chamber. The silence was heavier than gravity, pressing down on the mantle of High Counselor Vrax as he stared into the abyss of the tactical display. The enemy fleet was not a formation but a stain, a shifting nebulous cloud of void black hulls that absorbed starlight and returned only the cold promise of entropy. For cycles, the Zaltari had debated the nature of the encroaching darkness, analyzing vector trajectories and energy signatures with the detached arrogance of a species that had not known true predation in 1,000 rotations. But now the theoretical had become the terminal. The outer colonies were silent. The defensive perimeter, a masterpiece of crystalline energy grids that had stood for eras, was dissolving like sugar in hot water. There was no panic, for the Zaltari were creatures of immense discipline, but there was the sudden, horrifying realization that their discipline was nothing more than a structured way to die. Vrax looked to the other delegates, seeing his own dread mirrored in the compound eyes of the Krell matriarch and the shimmering, terrified bioluminescence of the aquatic Ulian ambassador. They had spent the last standard cycle arguing over trade tariffs and border disputes, squabbling over the crumbs of the galaxy while the devourer waited at the table. The tactical officer, a young Zaltari whose carapace had not yet fully hardened, spoke with a voice that trembled despite his best efforts to maintain protocol. The sensors were registering a total collapse of the 7th Sector's manifold barriers. The enemy was not just bypassing their defenses, they were rewriting the physics of the local space to make the defenses irrelevant. It was an insult as much as an attack. The council chamber, vast and echoing with the hum of ancient machinery, felt suddenly like a tomb. Vrax realized then that they were not waiting for a solution, they were waiting for the executioner. The enemy did not communicate. They did not broadcast demands for surrender or resources. They simply arrived, and where they passed, silence followed. In the midst of this suffocating despair, the sensor grid screamed. It was not the alarm of an enemy breach, but a confusion of the sensors themselves, a reading so anomalous that the main computer hesitated to display it. Space itself seemed to tear open, not with the brutal, tearing radiation of the enemy's warp drives, but with a surgical, terrifying precision. A rift opened at the edge of the system, silent and clean, devoid of the usual gravimetric distortion. From this tier emerged a vessel unlike anything in the archives of the Concordat. It was not the sleek, organic curve of Zaltari design, nor the jagged, industrial brutishness of the Krell. It was a block of gray geometry, scarred and utilitarian, a monolith of dull metal that seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. It possessed no visible engines, no glowing exhaust ports, no shimmering energy shields. It hung in the void like a stone dropped into a deep well, utterly motionless, utterly silent. The enemy fleet, the cloud of darkness that had been advancing with the inevitability of a tide, paused. For the first time since the invasion began, the devourers hesitated. "Identify," Vrax whispered, his voice cracking. The tactical officer's claws skittered across the interface, his panic replaced by a profound confusion. The vessel had no transponder. It emitted no energy signature that matched known physics. It was simply there, a physical impossibility sitting in the center of the kill zone. The enemy swarm, recovering from its momentary confusion, reoriented. Thousands of needle ships broke from the main cloud, turning their attention toward the gray monolith. They fired lances of antimatter and coherent hard light that could boil oceans and crack planetary crusts. The council watched, waiting for the gray ship to vaporize. They expected the flash of shielding failure, the debris field. Instead, they saw nothing. The beams struck the gray hull and simply ceased to exist. There was no flare of impact, no ripple of dispersion. The energy was not deflected, it was negated. The gray ship did not return fire, it did not maneuver. It sat in the hail of apocalyptic fire, with the indifference of a mountain weathering a spring rain. The psychological impact on the council was immediate and devastating. To see their greatest fears, the weapons that had dismantled their fleets, rendered useless against a silent geometric shape was beyond comprehension. The Krell matriarch clicked her mandibles in a rhythm of agitation, suggesting this was a trap, a new weapon of the enemy designed to mock them. Vrax disagreed. He felt a strange vibration in the floor plates, a deep S. A sonic hum that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate in the bone. The gray ship was waking up. It did not glow. It did not transform. It simply began to move. And it moved with a terrifying acceleration that defied inertia. One moment it was stationary, the next it was deep within the enemy formation. It did not fire energy beams. It launched projectiles. Small, kinetic slugs of dense matter propelled at a significant fraction of light speed. To a civilization that had mastered energy manipulation, kinetic weaponry was archaic, a relic of primitive history. But as the slugs struck the enemy vessels, the Council watched in horror as the advanced shielding of the Dark Fleet shattered. The kinetic force was overwhelming, brutal in its simplicity. Ships crumpled, hulls buckled, and the dark cloud began to bleed atmosphere and debris. "They are communicating," the communications officer announced, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own instruments. The signal was not directed at the Council nor at the enemy. It was a broadcast, omnidirectional and unencrypted, on a frequency so low and ancient it was almost below the threshold of their receivers. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration of war. It was a telemetry stream, data, pure, cold mathematics. The gray ship was broadcasting the enemy's shield modulation frequencies, their hull stress points, their tactical blind spots. It was dissecting the invincible enemy in real time and sharing the autopsy with everyone listening. Vrax stared at the data scrolling across his screen. It was a language of war he barely recognized, efficient, ruthless, devoid of art or honor. It was the language of extermination. The battle turned into a slaughter. The gray ship, which the sensors had finally tagged with a designation based on its hull markings, Terra, was a dancer in a field of wolves. It spun and vectored with impossible agility, its point-defense cannons weaving a net of kinetic death that the enemy could not penetrate. And yet it was not saving the Zaltari. It was ignoring them completely. It fought with a singular focus, driving a wedge through the enemy formation toward the massive dreadnought at the center of the cloud. The Council realized with a jolt of humility that they were not the prize to be saved. They were merely bystanders to a duel between titans. The gray ship was not a savior. It was a hunter, and it had finally found its prey. As the enemy dreadnought detonated, collapsing under a barrage of tactical nuclear warheads that the gray ship deployed with surgical precision, the silence returned to the void. The cloud dispersed, the survivors scattering into the deep dark, fleeing the gray monolith that now drifted among the wreckage. The Council chamber remained silent. They were alive. The invasion was broken, but the fear had not left. It had merely changed shape. Who were these beings? What power commanded a vessel that treated the scourge of the galaxy like a minor nuisance? Vrax ordered a channel to be opened. He composed himself, smoothing his ceremonial robes, preparing to offer gratitude, alliance, submission, whatever was required to keep that gray hull from turning toward their homeworld. "Unidentified vessel," Vrax began, his voice projected across the void. "This is High Counselor Vrax of the Zaltari Synod. We owe you our existence. We offer you—" "Stand down, Zaltari." The voice that cut him off was synthesized, flat and stripped of emotion, yet unmistakably organic in origin. It spoke their language perfectly, but with a cadence that suggested it had been learned from textbooks rather than conversation. "Keep your transmission channels clear. We are tracking a tertiary echo." "An echo?" Vrax asked, confused. "The enemy is defeated." "The enemy is a symptom," the voice replied. "You see an invasion, we see a leakage, the boundaries are thinning." The screen shifted, showing the gray ship turning slowly. For the first time, Vrax saw the damage. The gray hull was pitted, scarred by centuries of conflict. This was not a new ship fresh from a shipyard. It was an ancient gladiator, a vessel that had been fighting this war long before the Zaltari had even discovered fire. "We are not here for your gratitude. We are here to patch the hull of reality." The revelation struck Vrax with the force of a physical blow. The warship from nowhere was not an explorer. It was a custodian. The humans, if that is what they were not a young race stumbling into the galactic community. They were the old guard, the ones who stood on the wall while the rest of the galaxy played in the garden. The realization reshaped Vrax's entire understanding of the cosmos. The Zaltari prided themselves on their ancient lineage, their wisdom, their art. But here was a species that had discarded art for armor, who had traded their history for the eternal vigilance of the void. The philosophical weight of it was crushing, while the Council debated Tari. FFS, humanity had been in the dark, holding back the tide with kinetic slugs and nuclear fire, unthanked and unseen. "We wish to assist," Vrax said, the arrogance of his station finally evaporating. "If there is a greater threat, if the boundaries are failing." "Maintain your borders," the human voice commanded, not unkindly, but with the dismissal one gives to a child who offers to help with a dangerous task. "Rebuild your grids, Grow your crops, write your poetry. That is your function in this ecosystem. Our function is to ensure you have the time to do it. The connection was severed. The gray ship's engines flared, not with the clean blue of ion drives, but with the dirty, violent red of raw chemical propulsion boosted by exotic matter. It accelerated away from the planet, away from the light of the sun, heading back toward the rift, back into the deep cold where the monsters lived. Vrax watched it go until it was just a speck against the stars, then nothing. The council chamber began to fill with noise again, a cacophony of relief, of questions, of political maneuvering trying to spin this event into victory. But Vrax remained silent, staring at the empty space where the defenders of human might have been. He understood now. The galaxy was not a safe place governed by laws and treaties. It was a dark forest filled with terrors. And the reason the Zaltari could sleep at night, the reason they could dream of peace and commerce, was because somewhere in the dark, a gray ship was patrolling the perimeter, fighting a war that never ended, so that the innocents could pretend it never began. The humans were not gods. They were something far more terrifying and far more necessary. They were the janitors of the apocalypse, and they had work to do.